the wedding night, the largest room in the mansion, and the most powerful man in the city, Mafia Boss Rowan Mercer, didn't enter. He locked the door from the outside, tucked the key into his coat pocket, and sat down on the cold hallway floor and stayed there all night. Inside, Evelyn Ashcroft, the woman forced into marriage with the man the whole city feared, sat waiting in the darkness, not understanding what was happening. Welcome to my story. If you want to know why the Mafia Boss did this, please comment the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has progressed, and follow along to the end. The wedding had lasted 4 hours, not because anyone wanted it to, not because the guests were drunk on warmth or sentiment, or the kind of joy that makes people forget to check their watches. It lasted 4 hours because Rowan Mercer had arranged every second of it with the same cold precision he applied to everything else in his life. And no one in that ballroom, not the waitstaff, not the string quartet, not the 40-odd guests who had arrived in armored cars, was stupid enough to leave before he decided the evening was done. Evelyn Ashcroft sat through all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight and her face arranged into something that wasn't quite calm but passed for it under the chandelier light. She had practiced that expression in the mirror for 3 days. She wore it the way a soldier wears body armor. Not because it feels good, but because the alternative is worse. She didn't look at him during the ceremony. She looked at a fixed point 6 inches above the officiant's left shoulder and kept her breathing steady and signed the papers when the papers were put in front of her. Her handwriting didn't shake. She was proud of that afterward, in the hollow way you're proud of small things when the larger situation is completely out of your control. Rowan Mercer, 41 years old, 6'2", with the kind of build that comes from something other than vanity, from years of hauling himself through situations that required it. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw like it had been cut rather than grown, eyes that were gray, or close enough to gray that the distinction felt academic, and that carried in them a quality she couldn't name during the ceremony, and still couldn't name hours later when she was alone. Not cruelty, exactly. Something more disciplined than cruelty. A capacity for it, held in reserve. He controlled 4 of the city's 9 major distribution networks. He had interests in 3 legitimate construction firms, a private equity fund, and a shipping company that moved containers across the North Atlantic. He had been investigated by federal authorities on 6 separate occasions over the past 12 years. Nothing had ever stuck. What he also had, what Evelyn's father had accrued over 3 years of bad investments, worse decisions, and a catastrophic trust in the wrong financial partners, was the debt. $460,000 plus interest. The kind of number that starts as a manageable problem and compounds itself into an existential one before you notice it crossing the line. Her father, Gerald Ashcroft, was not a violent man or a dishonest one. He was a man who had built a small investment advisory firm over 20 years of careful work, who had 1 client too many and 1 referral he should have refused, and who had found himself 3 years later holding a liability he could not explain to a regulator without implicating himself in something he genuinely hadn't understood he was participating in. He had tried to get out quietly. The people he was trying to get out from had not let him. Rowan Mercer had acquired the debt 8 months ago. Evelyn still didn't know the exact mechanism. She knew only that one morning her father had called her, his voice stripped of everything except a kind of exhausted factuality, and told her that a man named Mercer now held their future in his hands, and that Mercer had made an offer. The offer was simple and obscene. The debt would be forgiven. The pressure would stop. Gerald Ashcroft would be permitted to live out whatever remained of his career in peace. In exchange, Evelyn would marry Rowan Mercer and take up residence in his estate on the north side of the city. She had not agreed immediately. She had spent 2 weeks trying to find another way, calling in every favor she had, talking to 2 attorneys and a financial advisor and an old friend whose brother worked in the district attorney's office. None of it led anywhere useful. The debt was legitimate on its face. The pressure being applied was subtle enough to be difficult to document. And her father was 63 years old with a heart condition and a look in his eyes that she had started to recognize as the early stages of a man deciding he was done. She had gone to Rowan Mercer herself, which she suspected was not what he had expected. She had sat down across from him in a restaurant that was very clean and very quiet, with her posture correct and her voice level, and told him she would agree to the arrangement on one condition, that her father was never contacted again by anyone connected to Mercer, for any reason, for the rest of his life. Mercer had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had said, "Agreed." Nothing else. No gloating, no performance. Just the word, flat and immediate, as if he'd been waiting for her to ask. She had walked out of that restaurant feeling like she'd survived something, which was not the same as feeling like she'd won. The ballroom emptied at 11. The guests filed out with the careful efficiency of people who understood they were excused rather than leaving of their own volition. Evelyn watched them go from her seat at the long head table, her champagne glass still mostly full, her wedding dress, white silk, because someone had made the decision and it hadn't been her, pooling around the chair legs. Rowan was speaking to a man near the exit. Short, 50s, thinning hair, the kind of suit that cost more than most people's rent. She didn't know who he was. She had stopped trying to catalog everyone at the reception after the first hour, when she realized that memorizing faces in that room was less a social skill and more a survival mechanism she hadn't yet been trained for. He caught her watching. He didn't react. Finished his conversation, shook the man's hand once, and walked back toward the table. "Ready," he said. It wasn't a question. "Does it matter?" she said. A pause. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't." They rode up in the elevator without speaking. The estate was 4 stories, converted from a building that had originally been something else. A private club, maybe, or a small hotel. The bones of it still visible in the ceiling heights and the width of the corridors. He had renovated it methodically. Every room she'd seen in the brief tour 2 weeks before the wedding was furnished with precision rather than warmth. Expensive, functional. The kind of space that said, "This is mine," without bothering to say, "Come in." The bedroom assigned to her was on the 3rd floor. Large windows facing the garden. A bed that was probably the nicest thing she'd ever been expected to sleep in. A wardrobe where her clothes, transferred from her apartment 3 days earlier by people she'd never met, had been hung with a care that felt oddly intrusive. She stopped at the door. He stopped too, a few feet back, and she turned to look at him and found him already looking at her with that same quality of attention she couldn't categorize. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "All right. This is a transaction. I'm not—" She stopped, reorganized. "I held up my end, I showed up, I signed, but that's all this is." He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, drew out a key, and turned it over once in his fingers. "Get some rest," he said. He stepped past her, inserted the key into the lock, and turned it. The door opened. He held it for her. She walked in. The room was exactly as she remembered it. The faint smell of clean linen, the city lights bleeding through the drapes, the particular silence of a space that has never been lived in. She turned around. He was already pulling the door closed. She heard the lock engage from the outside. She stood there in her wedding dress in the middle of the room and listened to his footsteps move a few feet down the hall, and then stop. And stay. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the door for a long time. Her heart was doing something she couldn't quite control, which she resented. She had trained herself out of panic years ago, or thought she had, but this was a specific flavor of the thing that didn't respond to the usual tools. Not fear of him. Fear of the absence of explanation. Fear of not knowing what the locked door meant. She waited for sounds. There were none except the occasional shift of weight from the hallway. She pressed her ear briefly to the door and heard nothing useful. Just breathing, slow and even, from the other side of the wall. She went to bed eventually. She didn't sleep for a long time. Morning came in gray and flat through the drapes. She woke at 6 because she'd been waking at 6 for 15 years, and her body didn't care that the previous evening had been strange and exhausting, and something she didn't have a name for yet. She changed out of the dress. She'd hung it on the wardrobe door the night before with more care than she felt, because it had cost a lot of money that hadn't been hers, and she was not, in the end, a person who let things go to waste carelessly. She put on dark trousers and a plain shirt, pulled her hair back. She opened the bedroom door. Rowan Mercer was sitting against the wall in the hallway, jacket folded beside him, collar open, looking exactly like a man who had spent the night on a hardwood floor and was not particularly bothered by this. He was awake. He was watching the far wall. He turned when she opened the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She looked at him on the floor and felt something she didn't want to name, something complicated and resistant, like a word she knew but couldn't quite produce. "You slept out here," she said. "I sat out here. All night." He stood in the unhurried way of someone whose body reports pain to the brain and the brain files it away for later. He picked up his jacket. "There's coffee," he said. "Kitchen's on the second floor." "That's what you're going with? Coffee?" He looked at her. "What do you want me to say?" An explanation would be a start. "Later," he said. "Coffee first." She wanted to push harder. She didn't. Not yet. Something about his face, not apologetic, not satisfied, just present in a way that was different from the night before, made her hold it for a minute. She followed him down the stairs. Bam! The kitchen was large and professionally equipped and smelled like actual coffee, not the pod machine approximation of it. He poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of her at the kitchen island. She picked it up. It was good. She didn't tell him that. "My father's debt," she said. "I've been saving. I have $60,000. It's everything I have. I want to start making payments." He was standing across the island, both hands wrapped around his mug, and he looked at her with an expression that was not quite what she expected. "No," he said. "I know it's not the full amount, but I'm good at my job. I can work out a—" "No," he said again. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" He set his mug down. He was quiet for a moment in the way that felt considered rather than hesitant. Then he walked around the island and out of the kitchen, and she followed him down a short corridor to a room she hadn't seen during the tour. It was an office, functional, a bit dark, books on 2 walls, a desk, a monitor that was currently off. He opened a drawer, removed a folder, thick with paper, held together with a black clip, and carried it back to the kitchen. He set it on the counter between them. She looked at it. "What's that?" "Open it." The folder was dense with documents. Financial records she recognized, transaction logs, wire transfer receipts, corporate registration papers, account statements from entities she'd never heard of. She turned pages, slowly at first and then faster, trying to pull meaning from the structure before she'd absorb the details. "Ashcroft Capital," she said, her father's firm. "Shell," Rowan said, "used to route roughly $40 million in a single 2-year window. Your father didn't set it up. The account was established using his company's registration number by a third party he had no knowledge of. By the time he discovered it, the trades had already cleared." She stopped turning pages. "The debt," she said carefully, "was constructed." He picked up his coffee. "To a specific purpose." "What purpose?" "You'll get there," he said. "Keep reading." She read. The coffee went cold at her elbow. Outside, the city had started its morning noise, distant traffic, a delivery vehicle somewhere below, the particular urban sound of a place getting back to work. She stood at the kitchen island in her plain shirt and read the 40-odd pages in the folder from beginning to end without speaking. When she finished, she closed the cover and looked at him. "My father found out," she said. "Yes." "He copied the records." "Before they could be purged, yes." "And then he disappeared." Rowan looked at her directly. There was no softening in it. He was not a man who did that. "He went into hiding," he said. "It's different." She absorbed this. "You know where he is?" Silence. "Mercer." "He's safe," he said. "That's all I can tell you right now." She put both hands flat on the counter. She could feel her pulse in her palms. "You arranged this marriage to protect him, to get me here, to—" She stopped. "You needed the records." "I needed you," he said. "The records are tied to an account your father registered in your name on your 18th birthday. An account you didn't know existed. It required authentication keys that had to mature over time. The final key activated 3 weeks ago." She stared at him. "You couldn't access it without me." "No one could." "But the people who want those records destroyed, they know it activated," he said. They've known for 3 weeks. They've been watching your family for months, waiting for you or your father to access it. The debt, the pressure, the whole structure of it. It was designed to make your family panic and search and eventually lead them to the files. The kitchen was very quiet. So this marriage, she said, was the fastest way to get you inside a defensible perimeter without tipping anyone off that we knew what the account contained. He looked at her steadily. Your father agreed to it. It was his idea, actually. My father suggested I marry you. He suggested the cover story, the debt, the arrangement. He thought it was the only way to get you somewhere safe long enough to do what needed doing. She thought about her father calling her with his voice stripped bare and factual and saying, a man named Mercer holds our future now. He was lying, she said. The whole call. He was telling me what to say. He was protecting you the only way he could. She was quiet for a long moment. Something large and difficult was working its way through her chest. She didn't let it reach her face. What's in the account? She said. Enough to dismantle a financial network that's been running for 19 years. Transaction records, board recordings, shell company contracts, offshore transfer documentation, names, dates, dollar amounts. The architects of the scheme are not small people. They have reach inside regulatory bodies, inside private security firms, inside... He paused. Enough places that getting those files to the right people has been extremely complicated. And you're one of the right people. He didn't answer that directly. I've been building a case for 4 years, he said. I've lost people doing it. The organization I run has one primary purpose, and it is not the things most people assume it is. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without the wedding and the ceremony and the necessity of holding herself together getting in the way. The night before the wedding, she said slowly, you knew there were people watching. I knew there were people inside the estate who had been positioned there. Inside. 3 of the catering staff, replaced within the final 48 hours. I identified them by late afternoon. By evening, I had confirmed they were tasked with surveillance, not violence. Their orders were to monitor whether you accessed any device, made any calls, showed any sign of knowing about the account. So you locked the door, she said. So they couldn't enter your room without passing me first. The hallway, the floor, the footsteps that stopped and stayed. She looked at the key still on the counter between them, where he'd set it after unlocking her door that morning. You could have told me, she said. It was your wedding night. Something shifted in his jaw. You'd been through enough. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't try to figure it out immediately. She picked up her cold coffee and drank what remained of it because she needed to do something with her hands. What happens now? She said. He reached past her and opened the folder again to a page she'd skimmed without fully absorbing. Coordinates. A server address. A string of activation codes. Now, he said, we open the account. She looked at the codes. Then she looked at him. Outside the window, the city was fully awake now, moving in all its ordinary directions, completely unaware of what was sitting in a kitchen on the north side of town in a folder between a mafia boss and the woman who had agreed to marry him for reasons that were turning out to be far more complicated than either of them had said out loud. If we open it, she said carefully, they'll know. Yes. How fast? He didn't hesitate. Hours. She set down the cup. Then we'd better be ready, she said. He looked at her. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to approval cross his face. Not warmth. That wasn't the word. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who has made a calculation and found that the variable he was uncertain about has come in correctly. There are things you need to know first, he said, about what's in those files, about the people who want them destroyed, about what 4 years of building this case has actually looked like. He paused. It's not a short conversation. I didn't have plans, she said flatly. He almost smiled, not quite, close enough to see the shape of it. Sit down, he said. I'll make more coffee. She sat. He moved to the machine. The folder sat between them on the counter, full of the kind of truth that changes the shape of everything you thought you understood. Somewhere in the city, in a location she didn't know yet, her father was alive and waiting. Somewhere in the same city, people who had built 19 years of invisible empire on the labor and ruin of others were watching their instruments for a signal that hadn't come yet. It would come soon. Evelyn Ashcroft folded her hands on the counter, looked at the man who was technically her husband and actually something she hadn't figured out yet, and waited for the full weight of the truth to arrive. She had no idea, sitting there in the quiet kitchen with the morning light coming gray and flat through the window, that within 36 hours she would be inside a burning building with no guarantee of walking out. She had no idea that the files her father had hidden weren't just financial records. They were evidence of something worse, something that made the money look like the least important part. The coffee was hot this time. She noticed that without meaning to, the small, irrelevant fact of it, because her brain was doing what her brain always did under pressure, which was catalog the immediate physical world in granular detail as a way of keeping the larger situation from becoming unmanageable. Hot coffee, gray light, a folder full of 19 years of organized crime sitting between her and a man she had been married to for approximately 14 hours. Rowan set the cup in front of her and remained standing. She had noticed that about him. He didn't sit when he could stand, didn't lean when he could be upright. It wasn't restlessness. It was something else, closer to readiness, like his body had decided at some point that relaxing was a liability and had never fully reversed the decision. The scheme, he said, didn't start as a scheme. She looked at him. It started as a fund, legitimate mostly, 12 investors, high net worth individuals, private equity background. They were making moves in emerging markets, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and for the first 3 years the returns were real. Then the returns started to compress, and someone in the group made a decision about how to keep the numbers moving. Who? A man named Caldwell Briggs. He ran the fund's compliance arm, which is the kind of irony that stops being funny pretty quickly. He brought in 2 partners, a woman named Sandra Voss, who controlled 3 brokerage accounts through proxy entities, and a man named Philip Okafor, who had relationships inside 2 separate regulatory bodies. With those 3 working in coordination, they could execute trades, report false valuations, and suppress any inquiry before it reached the stage of formal investigation. And my father's firm was one of 11 companies they used as pass-through vehicles over the course of 8 years. Your father's wasn't special. It wasn't targeted because of anything Gerald did or knew. It was targeted because it was small enough to be invisible and legitimate enough to be credible. He picked up his own cup. The problem was that your father is apparently the kind of man who reads his own paperwork. She almost said something, stopped herself. He found a discrepancy in a quarterly filing, Rowan continued, a routing number that didn't match any account he'd ever opened. He pulled the thread. It took him 11 months to understand what he'd found, and another 3 to copy everything without triggering any alerts on their monitoring systems. And then he came to you, she said. Rowan was quiet for a beat. He came to someone who came to me. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now. She looked at him steadily. You do that a lot. Give me the shape of a thing without the substance. I give you what's useful. That's not your call to make. Something in his face tightened, not anger, closer to the strain of a man who has operated alone for a long time and finds the experience of being questioned structurally disorienting. It is, he said, until we're past the part where telling you everything could get you killed. The kitchen was quiet. Tell me about the recordings, she said. You mentioned board recordings in the files. 3 years ago, Briggs held a series of closed meetings with the full investment group, all 12 original members. By that point, everyone in the fund knew what the operation had become. Those meetings were recorded without their knowledge by a device placed by someone inside the room. The recordings capture explicit discussion of the scheme, specific trade instructions, and at least 2 conversations about what to do with people who had become problems. She set down her cup. What kind of problems? 2 former employees of Voss's brokerage operation. They were dismissed within 6 months of each other. One moved abroad, one didn't. She sat with that. The recordings are in the account, he said, along with everything else. And once we open it, they have monitoring on the account's access nodes. It was set up years ago, when they first realized your father had copied the files. They've been watching every potential access point, The moment authentication completes, they'll have confirmation that someone is in the files. How long before they act? Based on what I know about how they operate, 6 hours, maybe 8. They'll want confirmation before they move. They'll try to identify who's accessing and from where before they commit to anything irreversible. And after they confirm, he didn't answer that with words. He didn't need to. She folded her hands on the counter. So we need somewhere to go. We need several things, he said, and I need to make some calls before we do anything else. He straightened. Stay in the building. I wasn't planning a walk. I mean it. Don't go near the windows on the ground floor. Don't answer the door. Don't use your phone to contact anyone. Not friends, not your office, not anyone. My phone has been monitored for 6 weeks. Not by me, he added, at the look on her face. By them. I identified it when I identified the surveillance on your apartment. My apartment was under surveillance. Since approximately 3 weeks after the account authentication keys matured. He said it without inflection, the way you say something that is simply true, and whose being true is not a matter of opinion. You've been watched every time you left your building, your grocery store, your morning run, the coffee place on Delaney Street that you stop at on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She was quiet. The specific detail of it, Tuesdays and Thursdays, the coffee place on Delaney, landed differently than the broader facts. It made it physical. It gave it a texture. For 6 weeks, she said. Yes. And you knew. For 4 of those 6 weeks. Yes. And you didn't. She stopped. Reorganized. You didn't warn me. Warning you would have changed your behavior. Changed behavior would have signaled to them that the surveillance had been identified. At that stage, I needed them to believe their operation was intact. He looked at her. There was something in it she couldn't call easy. I know what that cost. I'm not asking you to be comfortable with it. She stood up. She needed to move. She walked to the window, not the ground floor, she noted automatically, 2nd floor, kitchen, and looked out at the city doing its ordinary morning things and breathed. When this is over, she said to the window, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about what you get to decide on behalf of other people. When this is over, he said quietly, you can have any conversation you want. She turned around. He was watching her with that quality of attention again, the one she'd noticed at the wedding and at dinner and in the kitchen the first time, and that she still hadn't fully parsed. It wasn't soft. It wasn't cold. It was the look of a man who is paying very careful attention to something he has decided matters. Make your calls, she said. I'll be in the office at. She spent 2 hours in the office with the folder. She read it differently the second time, not looking for the overall architecture, but for the specific mechanisms. The way the shell companies were layered, the way the trade instructions were passed through intermediaries, each one a legitimate entity that couldn't be linked to the next by any obvious thread. The work of someone who understood both financial systems and how investigations of financial systems actually operated. Who knew which threads got pulled and which ones were left? It was elegant in the way that something constructed with extreme care and attention can be elegant even when what it's constructed for is wrong. She didn't enjoy noticing this. She noticed it anyway. She was on her 3rd read of the offshore transfer documentation when the door opened. The man who walked in was not Rowan. He was shorter, maybe 35, with a compact build and the kind of face that didn't offer anything unnecessary. Close-cropped hair, dark jacket, a small scar along the left side of his jaw that had healed cleanly enough to suggest professional medical attention. He moved without announcing himself, which in someone else would have been startling, and in him was just matter of fact. "You're Evelyn," he said. Not a question. Apparently. She didn't move her hands from the folder. "You are." "Marcus Tell. I work with Rowan." He looked at the folder on the desk. "He sent me up. He's on a call that's going long." "All right." He pulled a chair from the side of the desk and sat down without being invited. She registered this. "You've read the full folder," he said. "Twice. You understood it. Enough of it." She looked at him. "What's in the recordings that Rowan hasn't told me?" A pause. His eyes were steady. "What makes you think he left something out?" "He's been careful about what sequence he gives me information in, which means there's a sequence he's managing, which means something in the recordings is worse than what he's told me. Marcus looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man adjusting his assessment of a situation. One of the meetings, he said. The third one. Briggs runs through a list of contingencies. What happens if the files surface? What happens if a regulator gets to certain documents before they can be managed? He stopped. And one of the contingencies involves your father specifically, by name. Briggs asks about the status of the Ashcroft problem. One of the other voices, they're still working on identification, says it's been handled. The office was very quiet. Handled, she said. That was 3 years ago, Marcus said carefully. Your father is alive, we know where he is, but whoever said it in that room believed at the time that they had handled it, she said again. Yes. She looked at the folder. She thought about her father's voice on the phone, stripped of everything but careful, constructed calm. She thought about 11 months of pulling a thread, and 3 months of copying files, and whatever had happened after that had led him to a hiding place she didn't know the location of, and a plan that had put his daughter in a mafia boss's kitchen on the morning after her wedding. He knew they thought he was dead, she said slowly. We believe so. That was part of how he stayed hidden. They stopped looking because they thought the problem was resolved. It's what we think, yes. She sat with this for a moment. There was grief in it, and there was anger, and underneath both of those there was something that felt like the cold, clarifying edge of real purpose, which was an unusual thing to feel, and she didn't examine it too closely. Who's in the room? She said. In the third recording. How many voices? 7 distinct speakers. Briggs and 2 others are identified. The remaining 4 are works in progress. How long have you been working on it? Identification? 14 months. What's blocking it? The recording quality deteriorates in the second half. Whoever placed the device, we don't know who, we've been trying to find out, positioned it well, but the battery was failing by the time the third meeting ran long. She thought about that. Voice analysis software. Tried 4 different platforms. 3 give partial matches with confidence levels too low to be actionable. The 4th... He stopped again. She looked at him. What? The 4th gave us a match on one of the 4 unknown speakers. High confidence. 87%. Who? Marcus looked at the door, then back at her. Someone inside the Federal Financial Crimes Division, he said. Someone who, if that identification is correct, has been in a position to manage every formal investigation of Briggs and his partners for the past 9 years. She felt the specific, particular sensation of a floor you'd trusted shifting under you, not falling, just the first announcement that it might not hold. Rowan knows this, she said. Rowan has known for 6 weeks. Is that why he hasn't taken the files to federal authorities? It's part of why. Marcus leaned forward. The other part is that we don't know who else. One identified voice inside a regulatory body means there are potentially more we haven't identified. Walking into the wrong office with those files doesn't just fail. It actively burns the case and everyone connected to it. She understood. She understood it completely, and she also understood why Rowan had given her the architecture before the specifics. And she was furious about both things simultaneously. About what he'd withheld, and about the fact that he'd had a reason. Rowan came back 40 minutes later. He looked at Marcus first, and something passed between them in the language of people who have worked together long enough to have a shorthand for most situations. Marcus stood and left without speaking. Rowan sat down across from her. The third recording, she said. He didn't look surprised. He looked, if anything, like a man who had been expecting a specific thing to arrive and is neither relieved nor troubled that it finally has. Yes, he said. They thought my father was dead. Yes. For 3 years, they've been operating on the assumption that the problem was resolved. And then the authentication keys matured and the account activated, and they realized he'd been alive the whole time. And that the files still existed, Rowan said, which was worse from their perspective than him surviving. The files are what matters. A man who's hiding can stay hidden. Files that activate on a specific date mean someone planned for them to be found. They panicked, she said. Controlled panic. They're not unsophisticated. But yes. The mole inside federal crimes. He looked at her. Marcus told me. He looked at the door Marcus had gone through, then back. That wasn't his information to share. It's my father's life, she said. Flat. No heat in it. Worse than heat. It's my life. You don't get to decide what I know about my own situation. The muscle in his jaw moved. The identification isn't confirmed. 87%. Isn't confirmed. Rowan. She said his name the way you say a word when you need it to mean something specific, and you need the other person to understand what that specific thing is. If you keep giving me the architecture without the load-bearing walls, I cannot help you. And you need my help. You need my authentication for those files. You can run your operation without me in the room, maybe, but you cannot open that account without me physically present, which means I am already in this, whether you are comfortable with that or not. He was quiet for a long moment. The man identified in the recording, he said, is a senior director named Arthur Pell. He's been in his current position for 11 years. Before that, private sector compliance, which is where we think he crossed paths with Briggs originally. He picked up a pen from the desk and set it down again in a different place, which was the closest thing to restlessness she'd seen from him. If Pell is compromised, then every formal channel we might use is suspect until we know who else in his division has been managed, which means when we transmit the files, we cannot go through federal financial crimes as the primary recipient. Then who? We've identified 3 journalists with the right infrastructure and enough distance from the regulatory ecosystem to be usable. We've identified 2 international regulators, one in the UK, one in the Netherlands, who are outside Pell's reach. And we've been in contact through several layers of intermediary with a federal prosecutor in a different district who has been building a parallel case on Briggs for unrelated matters and who does not share infrastructure with Pell's division. You've been building this simultaneously. For 4 years. Alone. With Marcus and 2 others. She looked at him. How many people have you lost? His face didn't change. 2. To this. Yes. She absorbed this. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it plainly without performance. He looked at her as if the words had arrived from an unexpected angle. He didn't respond to them directly. The account, he said, we need to open it today. Tonight at the latest. Every hour we wait is an hour they have to tighten whatever they're currently moving into position. What are they moving? We've identified increased communication between Briggs's private security operation and 2 contractors they've used before. And this morning, before 6 a.m., 2 vehicles were parked on the street outside this building that were not there yesterday and are not registered to anyone in this neighborhood. He held her gaze. They're not moving yet, but they're close. She thought about the hallway, the floor, his footsteps stopping and staying. Last night, she said, the catering staff you identified were removed before the guests arrived, quietly. They were replaced with my own people. Did they know they'd been made? No. So whoever sent them still doesn't know we identified them, which means they believe their surveillance from last night gave them clean intelligence, which gives us a small window where they think they know more than they do. She understood the window. She understood exactly what it was worth and how fast it would close. I need to know the full authentication process, she said. Every step. I need to know what happens on their end the moment we initiate access. I need to know where we'll be when we do it and what the exit plan is after. That's going to take... Then we'd better start now, she said. They worked through the afternoon. Marcus returned and spread 3 laptops across the dining room table, along with a set of printed network maps she found initially incomprehensible and 30 minutes later could read fluently. A 4th person arrived around 2, a woman named Yara, small and precise, who handled the technical infrastructure and spoke directly to machines in a way that suggested she found them more reliable than people. She didn't say much to Evelyn. She didn't say much to anyone. Evelyn learned the authentication sequence in 2 hours. It required 4 separate verification steps, 2 of which depended on personal data only she could supply. Her mother's maiden name combined with a street address from her childhood, and a security phrase her father had apparently whispered to her at age 7 at the specific instruction of a contingency letter that had been waiting in a law firm's sealed records ever since. She remembered the phrase. She hadn't known that she remembered it until Marcus read it off the paper, and something in her chest recognized it before her brain caught up. Her father, apparently, had planned for everything. The thought of it, the careful, patient, terrified love of it, was something she could not afford to sit with right now, so she filed it and moved on. By 4 in the afternoon, they had the sequence rehearsed, the transmission targets locked, and a physical location identified. An off-site server facility on the south end of the city, not connected to any of Rowan's known infrastructure, that Yara had been quietly building access into over 6 months of preparation. At 4:30, Rowan's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something in his face shifted in a way that was too controlled to be readable, which meant it was bad. He stepped out of the room. Evelyn looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking at the door. "What?" she said. "Don't know yet." But Rowan has 3 people I know of who would call that number. One of them is in this room. One of them is me." He paused. "The third is your father." She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. She was at the door when Rowan came back through it, and she read his face in the first half-second and knew. "He moved," Rowan said. "Gerald moved from the safe house. We don't know why. We don't know when. Sometime in the last 8 hours. The contact who checks on him arrived this morning and the house was empty." "Empty," she said. "Clean. No sign of struggle. He left on his own. He took his bag. He ran. Or he found out something that made staying feel more dangerous than moving." Rowan looked at her steadily. "There's a third option." She already knew what the third option was. She'd known it in the half-second before he came back through the door. "Someone told him we were opening the account today," she said. "Someone told him, and he decided to do something about it himself." "That's what I think, yes." "Which means someone in this room—" "No." His voice was sharp and certain. "Not this room. The safe house arrangement was known to one additional person outside this team, someone I trusted and am now revising my assessment of." Marcus said something in a low voice she didn't fully catch. Rowan responded in the same register. Evelyn stood in the middle of the room and thought about her father. 63 years old, bad heart. 3 years in hiding, running from people who thought they'd already killed him, who were only now realizing they hadn't. A man who had spent 3 years carrying the weight of what he'd found and what it had cost him and what he'd done to protect it, and who had apparently just decided, for reasons she couldn't know yet, that waiting was no longer an option. "We opened the account tonight," she said, "earlier than planned." Rowan looked at her. "If he's moving," she said, "it's because he knows something we don't. And if he knows something we don't, the window we think we have is already shorter than we calculated. We go tonight." Yara, without looking up from her screen, said, "The facility will be accessible from 9 p.m. 9 it is," Evelyn said. Rowan didn't argue. He looked at her for a moment, that look, the one she still couldn't fully name, and then he nodded once and turned to begin the reorganization of everything they'd planned for tomorrow into something that had to work tonight instead. She stood in the middle of the room and breathed, in and out. The city outside the windows was going dark at the edges, the light thickening into that particular late afternoon gold that precedes evening. Somewhere in it, her father was moving through streets she couldn't see, toward a purpose she couldn't yet guess, carrying the weight of a secret he had protected for 3 years at the cost of everything. She picked up the page with the authentication codes. She read her father's contingency phrase one more time, silently, in her own mind. Then Yara looked up from her screen, and her face was the face of someone who has found something they were not expecting to find, and she said, very quietly, "Rowan, the vehicle's outside. There are 6 now," Yara said. "There were 4 at 3 o'clock. There are 6 now." Nobody moved for a half-second that felt structural, like the pause before something load-bearing gives way. Rowan was already at the window, not close to it, 2 feet back, angled, looking out along the edge of the drape rather than through it. Evelyn watched him count without moving his lips. "South side of the street," he said. 2 more on the corner." "The corner wasn't covered before," Marcus said. "No. They're boxing the block." "Not yet. If they were boxing it, there'd be coverage on the north alley." He stepped back from the window. "They're staging. They want visual confirmation of movement before they commit." "Confirmation of what movement?" Evelyn said. "Ours." He turned from the window. Someone told them we were moving tonight. The room went quiet in a particular way. The kind of quiet that has a specific texture. The texture of people recalculating simultaneously and arriving at the same place from different directions. Marcus said, "Lena." Rowan's face did something difficult and brief. "We don't know that." "You said one person outside this team knew the safe house. You said you were revising your assessment." "I said I was revising it. I didn't say I'd finished." "Rowan, not now." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It dropped instead into a register that meant the conversation was over. He turned to Yara. "Can we move the facility access earlier? 8 instead of 9. Yara was already typing. "The access window opens at 8:47. That's the earliest the secondary authentication allows." 8:47 then. "That's 2 hours and 12 minutes from now," Evelyn said. "I know what time it is. And they're outside. They're staging. They won't move on a stationary target. Too much exposure. They need us in transit." He looked at her directly. "Which means we need to give them something to look at. A decoy." "Marcus will take the car out at 8:59 east route, visible from the corner position. They'll follow him because they'll have to. They can't confirm it's not us without pursuing. And if they pull resources off the building to follow a decoy car, the window tightens, but it opens. And if they don't follow, then we learn something about how much they know." He said it flatly. "Either way, we learned something." Evelyn looked at him. She thought about 6 vehicles boxing a city block around a building she was standing in, and her father somewhere in the city moving toward an unknown objective, and a federal director whose voice had been recorded in a room discussing the disposal of people who had become problems. And she thought, this is what the folder actually meant, not the numbers, not the transaction logs. This, 6 cars, a staged decoy, a facility access window that opened at 8:47, and a man standing in a room deciding how to survive the next 2 hours. "I'm going with you," she said. "To the facility." "No. The authentication requires me." "You can do 2 of the 4 steps remotely. Yara can. Steps 3 and 4 require physical presence. You know that. We went over it for 4 hours this afternoon." She held his gaze. "You're not leaving me here." Something moved in his face. Not capitulation. He didn't have the architecture for easy capitulation. More like a man looking at a calculation he doesn't like and acknowledging that the math is correct regardless of his preference. "Stay close to me," he said. "Every second we're outside, you stay within arm's reach. Non-negotiable." "Fine." "I mean it." "I said fine, Rowan." He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned to begin the logistics. They went out through the basement at 8:19, 4 minutes after Marcus's car pulled away from the front entrance with its headlights on, and its pace unhurried, the careful speed of someone who believes they are unobserved. Evelyn had watched the corner vehicles from the second-floor window. 2 of them pulled out within 90 seconds. The other 4 remained. She filed this information away and didn't say anything about it to Rowan until they were in the service corridor under the building, moving toward a door that opened onto a side street that was, for the moment, not visible from the remaining vehicles. 4 stayed, she said. "I saw." They split the team. They think 2 cars is enough to follow Marcus, and they kept 4 on the building. "Yes." "Which means they have more people than you expected." He didn't answer this. He moved to the door and checked something she couldn't see, a mirror, angled, mounted at low height on the wall beside the frame, which gave him a sliver of view along the exterior alley. He stood there for 30 seconds. Then he pushed the door open, and they went out. The alley was cold and smelled like wet concrete and exhaust. The city noise was closer out here, the particular density of sound that a large city produces in the early evening. Traffic at medium distance, someone somewhere above them playing music at low volume, the ambient hum of infrastructure. Yara was 2 steps behind Evelyn, carrying a bag that Evelyn had been told not to ask about and had not asked about. A 4th person. She hadn't learned his name. She'd been introduced to him as simply K and had accepted this, was in front, moving ahead by 30 feet and checking the mouth of the alley before signaling back. They covered 3 blocks on foot in 11 minutes. Evelyn's shoes were wrong for this. She'd changed out of the heels from the night before, but the flat-soled boots she'd found in her wardrobe were not broken in, and she could feel a blister developing on her right heel. She noted this and moved on. There was nothing useful to be done about it. The vehicle waiting on the fourth block was unremarkable in every deliberate way. Old model, neutral color, the kind of car that a city street absorbs without comment. Evelyn got in the back with Rowan. Yara took the front. Kay drove. Nobody spoke for the first 8 minutes. Evelyn watched the city pass and counted cross streets and thought about the sequence she was about to execute and whether she was going to be able to hold the security phrase steady in her memory when the moment came. It was there. It had been there since Marcus read it off the paper, and her chest had recognized it before her mind did. It would stay. "When did you start building the case?" she said to Rowan. The quiet needed something in it. He was looking out his window. 4 years and 3 months ago. What happened 4 years and 3 months ago? A pause that lasted long enough to be a decision. "My brother," he said. He ran a small transport operation, legitimate. He'd borrowed to expand and found himself holding a loan from an entity that turned out to be one of Briggs's layered shells. When the fund needed capital repositioning, they called the loan early. My brother's company folded in 6 weeks. He was still looking out the window. He didn't handle it well. She didn't ask him to define that further. So it was personal from the start. Everything is personal from the start. Anyone who tells you different is lying about their motives. He turned from the window. The difference is whether you let the personal thing make you sloppy, and you haven't. I've tried not to. 4 years is a long time to try. Yes, he said. It is. The facility was a low building on the south edge of the city's commercial district, unmarked, positioned between a logistics warehouse and a parking structure in a way that made it architecturally forgettable. Yara had access credentials for the side entrance. They were inside by 8:51. The server room was cold and loud in the specific way of server rooms, the aggressive, climate-controlled hum of machines that run continuously and have no interest in human comfort. Banks of equipment on 2 walls, a workstation at the far end. Yara moved to it immediately and began the setup process with the focused efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this specific sequence many times in her head. 12 minutes to establish the secure transmission tunnel, Yara said without looking up. 14 at most. Rowan positioned himself near the door. Kay had stayed outside in the corridor. Evelyn moved to the workstation and looked at the screen where the authentication interface had materialized. Spare, functional, no graphics, just fields waiting to be filled. "Step 1, she said. "Ready when you are," Yara said. She filled the first field. Date of birth, formatted in a specific non-standard way her father had specified in the contingency letter. Day first, then year, then month, the kind of inversion that was meaningless to anyone who hadn't been told. Second field, her mother's maiden name combined with the street address from her childhood, run together without spaces. She typed it without hesitation. "Step 1 confirmed," Yara said. Step 2 was a numeric sequence derived from a formula her father had encoded in a document that had been held by a third-party law firm and released to Rowan 6 weeks ago through a chain of intermediaries she still didn't fully understand. Rowan read it to her from a folded paper. She entered it. Step 2, confirmed. Steps 3 and 4 were the ones that required physical presence. Biometric verification through a reader Yara had mounted to the workstation, thumbprint, and retinal. Evelyn placed her thumb. She looked into the scanner. It was an odd thing, the sensation of a machine confirming you are who you are, like being recognized by something that has no feeling about the recognition at all. Step 3 confirmed. She straightened. Step 4 was the phrase. She had been carrying it in her chest since Marcus read it off the page, and she said it now clearly and without pause, directly to the voice recognition module. 7 words that her father had whispered to her at age 7, in a kitchen very different from any kitchen she'd stood in since. A phrase she hadn't known she remembered until she heard it named and found it sitting there, intact and undiminished, in the place where she'd stored it without knowing she was storing it. The screen held for 3 seconds. Then it changed. "Authentication complete," Yara said. Her voice was level and controlled. "We're in." The files began to populate on the screen, not quickly. The archive was enormous, and the connection was doing what it could, which was working steadily through thousands of documents in a sequence that would take time. Transaction logs first, labeled and sorted. Then audio files, the board recordings, dozens of them. Then the corporate registration documents, the offshore account records, the correspondence chains. "Begin transmission," Evelyn said. "Already running," Yara said. "Journalists first, then international regulators, then the federal prosecutor's office. Estimated time to complete all 3 primary transmissions, 41 minutes. 41 minutes. Evelyn looked at the door where Rowan was standing. "They'll know in minutes," he said, "as soon as the access node registers." "How many minutes?" 3, maybe 5. "Then we hold this room for 41 minutes. "We hold this room for 41 minutes, he agreed. It was 8:59 Shazing. At 9:04, Kay opened the door from the corridor and said, "We have movement at the south entrance, 2 vehicles." Rowan moved past Evelyn without touching her. She heard him and Kay in the corridor in low, rapid exchange. She did not move from the workstation. The transmission counter read 11%. She watched it and breathed. At 9:08, she heard something from the direction of the south entrance that might have been a door and might have been something else. Rowan was back in the room 30 seconds later. "Building has 3 other access points," he said. "Kay is covering south. I need you to tell me the moment transmission hits 40%. At 40%, the journalists have enough to publish the core documents regardless of whether we complete." "Understood. Don't move from that chair." "I won't." He left again. She sat in the cold, loud room and watched the counter move. 14%, 15. The audio files were transmitting alongside the documents. She could see the progress bar for the recordings moving in a separate track on the screen. The third board meeting, the one with Briggs's voice discussing contingencies and the Ashcroft problem, was one of the larger files. It was moving, 20%. She heard sounds she couldn't interpret from somewhere in the building. Raised voices, briefly, and then silence, and then something she chose not to think about too specifically. 26%. Rowan came back at 9:17. He had a cut along his left forearm that he was holding closed with his right hand and not drawing attention to. She saw it immediately and said nothing about it immediately, because he came in and went directly to the door and looked at Yara and said, "How long?" And Yara said, 22 minutes. And he said, "We need 17. "I can't make it faster," Yara said. "I know." He looked at the cut. He caught Evelyn looking at it. "It's not deep." "I know what a deep cut looks like," she said. "Sit down." "I can't." "Sit down for 30 seconds and let me look at it." He sat. She had nothing useful medically, but she could see that he was right. It was a long cut, but not a dangerous one, already slowing. She pulled a clean cloth from her jacket pocket, pressed it to the wound. "What happened at the south entrance?" she said. "Managed." "How many?" 2. "There are more coming." He looked at her steadily from the chair, and in the cold light of the server room, with the hum of the machines around them and the transmission counter at 31%, his face had a quality she hadn't seen in it before. Not fear. The thing that lives adjacent to fear in people who've trained fear out of the front of their minds. A complete, unsentimental acknowledgement of the actual odds. 31%, Yara said, not turning from the screen. Evelyn held the cloth against his arm and looked at him. "Who is Lena?" she said. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise. The shift of someone who has been waiting for a specific question to arrive. "She was the 4th member of the team," he said. "Before you." "Before me." "She ran network intelligence. She was the one who first identified the safe house location for your father. She was the one who designed the monitoring protocol that identified the surveillance on your apartment." He looked at the wall. "She left the team 8 weeks ago. Personal reasons were given. I accepted them." "And the person who knew about the safe house outside this team was Lena." He said it flatly, the flatness of a man who has been carrying a bad calculation for hours and is now simply stating it. She burned the safe house. I believe so. And told them you were moving tonight. I believe so. How? He didn't answer immediately. We had contact 3 weeks ago. After she left the team, she reached out. I responded. It was brief, and I thought it was conclusive. He looked at the cloth she was holding against his arm. I may have confirmed the timeline without realizing I was doing it. Evelyn sat with this. There was anger available to her, and she chose not to use it right now because it wouldn't help with anything that was currently happening. 40%, Yara said. Evelyn stood up. The journalists have what they need. Core documents, yes. The recordings are at 22%. The recordings are what put specific names on specific decisions, Evelyn said. We need those to complete. I know. She looked at Rowan, who had stood when she stood and was holding the cloth against his own arm now. The international regulators, she said, and the federal prosecutor. 58 minutes combined at current rate. What do we need to get to a position where they can complete without us physically present? Yara turned from the screen for the first time. She had a particular quality to her stillness that was different from the stillness of before. If I can get the transmission to 60%, she said, I can set a continuation protocol. The system will finish on its own through the tunnel, but I need the connection to hold stable for another 9 minutes to reach 60. 9 minutes, Evelyn said. Without interruption to the connection, Yara said. Any physical interference with this room, anyone cutting the line, anyone accessing the hardware? 9 minutes, Rowan said. We can give you 9 minutes. He looked at Evelyn. Kay can't cover South alone. I need to go back. She looked at the door. She looked at the counter. 43%. Go, she said. He looked at her with that look. The one she had named finally, standing in the cold server room with the transmission running and the sound of something somewhere in the building that she still wasn't letting herself think about too specifically. The look was not admiration, and it was not warmth, and it was not the careful professional attention of a man managing an asset. It was the look of someone who sees another person clearly, without the filter of what they expected or needed that person to be. He went. 9 minutes. She pulled her chair to the workstation and watched the counter and breathed. 47%. 51. At 54%, Yara said very quietly, Someone is on the roof. Evelyn looked at the ceiling. There was sound above them. Not movement exactly, more like weight redistributing across a surface, slow and deliberate. They're looking for the relay antenna, Yara said. If they find it and disconnect it, how long to 60? 4 minutes. Can you reroute through a secondary connection? Yara was already working. It'll slow the rate. 58% would take... The sound on the roof changed. Stopped. Then the connection indicator on Yara's screen dropped by 6 points in 2 seconds. They found it, Yara said. Her voice had something in it now that was very controlled but not quite calm. We're losing signal integrity. 55%. 54. 53. Evelyn stood up. What do you need to hold it? The antenna is on the northeast corner of the roof. If someone can physically maintain the connection, tell me what to do when I get there. Evelyn, tell me what to do. Yara told her. It was simple and it was physical, and it required being on the roof of a building where someone with a different objective was currently also standing, and Evelyn registered all of this and walked to the door. The corridor was empty. She moved along it fast, found the stairwell at the far end, went up 2 flights. The roof access door was unlocked. She pushed it open and the cold hit her immediately. The real cold, the open-air city cold, wind and the smell of exhaust, and the ambient light of 1,000 buildings throwing their glow up into the low clouds. The roof was flat and functional. HVAC units, drainage channels, the relay antenna on the northeast corner exactly where Yara had said. And between her and the antenna, with his back to her and a cable cutter in his hand, was a man she did not recognize. He hadn't heard her come through the door. She looked at the antenna. She looked at the cable, partially cut, hanging loose. She looked at the man. She picked up the only thing within reach. A loose section of conduit, iron, maybe 18 inches, left by whatever crew had last done maintenance on the rooftop units. She had never hit anyone with anything in her life. She crossed the roof in 12 steps, The man heard her at step 9 and began to turn. She was faster than that. The antenna connection was intact enough. She held the severed cable end to the housing the way Yara had described, and with her other hand sent a text to Yara's number, 2 words, the signal they'd agreed on, and 3 seconds later the connection indicator on the screen below, which she couldn't see but could only trust, either stabilized or it didn't. She was on the roof in the cold with a man unconscious at her feet, and the city spread out below her in every direction, full of its ordinary evening business, its restaurants and traffic, and lit windows where people were doing things that had nothing to do with any of this. She held the cable against the housing and breathed. Her phone buzzed. 1 word from Yara. Holding. 57%. She held the cable and watched the city and tried to decide who she was now, standing here. Whether the woman who had signed a piece of paper in a ballroom 42 hours ago and practiced keeping her face still in a mirror was the same person holding a damaged antenna cable on a rooftop with her hands starting to shake from the cold and the adrenaline, or whether something in the last 2 days had moved her into territory that woman wouldn't have recognized. She thought she knew the answer. She wasn't sure she was ready for it. Her phone buzzed again. It wasn't Yara. The number was one she didn't recognize, but the text was 3 words, and 2 of them were her name, and one of them was a word her father used for her, and only for her, and that no one outside her family had ever known. She stared at the screen, then she read the full message, and she understood in the space of 10 seconds why her father had left the safe house, what he had gone to do, what it was going to cost. And she understood something else, something cold and specific and structural, the kind of understanding that rearranges the architecture of everything you thought you knew about a situation. The 4th step of the authentication sequence, the voice recognition, the 7 words she had said to the scanner 63 minutes ago. Her father hadn't encoded that phrase to protect the account. He had encoded it because the phrase itself was a signal, a separate transmission, sent simultaneously to a separate address on a separate network the moment her voice matched the stored pattern. An address that had nothing to do with Rowan Mercer or Yara or any server in this building. Her father had built a second contingency inside the first one, and the address the signal had gone to was now texting her from an unknown number, telling her in 3 words that she needed to stop the primary transmission immediately because the federal prosecutor Rowan had spent 4 years cultivating as a clean channel. She read the message 3 more times. The wind on the roof was cold enough to make her eyes water, or that was what she told herself. Her thumb hovered over the screen. The cable in her other hand was still pressed against the antenna housing, and below her in the server room the transmission was running at 57% and climbing, sending years of evidence toward a man who her father was now telling her, in 3 words and a name only 2 people in the world knew, was compromised. The federal prosecutor, Daniel Rourke, 4 years of Rowan's work, the clean channel, the alternative to a regulatory system infected by Arthur Pell's reach. Not clean. She typed back. How do you know? The response came in 40 seconds, which meant her father was somewhere with his phone in his hand, watching the screen, waiting. He was in the room, 3 meetings. I have a 4th recording, you don't. She stared at the screen. A 4th recording, not in the account, not in the files that were currently transmitting to 3 destinations at 58% and rising. Something her father had held back. Something he'd carried separately, outside the digital archive, for reasons she now understood completely. Because he hadn't known who would access the account. Because he hadn't known which version of the plan would survive contact with reality. Because Gerald Ashcroft, who read his own paperwork and pulled threads and copied files for 11 months without tripping a single alert, had built not 2 contingencies but 3, and had waited until the moment his daughter's voice hit a scanner 60 feet below her to release the 3rd one. Stop the transmission to Rourke, the next message read. The other 2 are fine. Only Rourke. She looked at the cable in her hand. She looked at the city. She had 9 seconds to decide whether to trust a message from an unknown number carrying her father's private word for her, or to hold the cable and let the transmission complete to all 3 targets and find out later whether the 4th recording was real. She texted Yara. Getting back down the stairwell took 90 seconds. The man on the roof was still down when she left. She didn't look at him again. Yara looked up when she came through the server room door, and Evelyn read her face in the first half second. The counter was at 61%. The continuation protocol was active, and Yara had already isolated the Rourke transmission channel from the other two and suspended it at the moment Evelyn's text had come through. 41 seconds ago. Journalists are at 63%, Yara said. International regulators at 58, both continuing. Rourke. Suspended at 51%. Yara looked at her steadily. You want to tell me why? My father has a fourth recording. Yara was quiet for a beat that was very precisely one beat, and no more. How reliable is the source? It's my father. That's not what I asked. It's my father, Evelyn said again, with a different weight on it. Yara held her gaze for a moment, then turned back to the screen. The suspension will hold as long as the tunnel is active. If Rourke's people are monitoring the transmission, and if he's compromised, they will be, they'll see the flow stop. They'll know something changed. How fast will they act on that? Depends on how much they know about what's in the files. Yara pulled up a secondary window. If Rourke has been briefed by Pell's network on the content of the archive, they'll understand immediately what a partial transmission means. They'll try to cut the whole tunnel before the journalists and regulators complete. How long until journalists complete? 14 minutes at current rate. 14 minutes? Evelyn pulled out her phone and called the unknown number. It rang twice. Evelyn, her father's voice. 63 years old, and it sounded every year of it, worn down to something that was still recognizably him, but thinner, like fabric that has been washed too many times. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them. Where are you? She said. I can't tell you that right now. Dad, I'm all right. I need you to listen. His breathing was audible. He was moving while he talked, or had recently stopped moving. The fourth recording is on a physical drive. I've been carrying it. I didn't put it in the account because I didn't know who would access the account first, and Rourke's name is in the first 20 minutes of that recording. Doing what? Agreeing to manage a specific investigation into Briggs's fund that had originated in his district. Taking a number. Discussing a second payment contingent on the case being formally closed without prosecution. A pause. His breath. He's not a peripheral figure, Evelyn. He's been a core part of the protection architecture for 6 years. She thought about 4 years of Rowan's work. The clean channel. She thought about what it meant to build something for 4 years on a foundation that had been rotten from the beginning. I need to tell Rowan, she said. Yes. Where are you going with the drive? I have a contact, someone I identified independently, not through Mercer, not through anyone in that building, a journalist. She's been building her own case on Briggs from the financial side for 2 years, and she has the infrastructure to receive a physical drive and verify it and publish within hours. Who is she? He gave her a name. She didn't recognize it. She's real, he said, as if reading the silence. I've met her. In person, 3 times over the past year. You've been running a parallel track, she said slowly. I've been your father, he said. I've been trying to make sure that if any one part of this failed, another part survived. She stood in the cold server room and thought about the man who had built a contingency inside. A contingency inside a contingency over 3 years of hiding, carrying a physical drive, and a journalist's name and a private phrase for his daughter on the off chance that the architecture everyone else had built turned out to have a crack. The transmission, she said. We're at 63% to the journalists and 58% to international regulators, without Rourke. That's enough, he said. If the journalists have 60% of the archive and the physical drive, it's more than enough. Rourke will know the transmission was interrupted. Yes. He'll move. He's already moving, her father said. That's why I left the safe house. I found out this morning that Rourke's office had issued 2 travel authorizations to personnel who have no legitimate reason to be in this city tonight. I couldn't reach Mercer directly without risking the safe house's position, so I moved, and I'm trying to reach the journalists before Rourke's people understand what the partial transmission means. She heard something in his breathing that she didn't like. Are you being followed? I don't think so. I've been careful. Dad. She put everything she had into keeping her voice level. You have a heart condition and you've been alone for 3 years, and you're moving across a city at night with a physical drive that multiple people want to destroy. Where exactly are you? Evelyn, tell me a cross street, a landmark, something. A pause, then, corner of Marsh and 11th. I'm heading east. She looked at Yara. Yara was already pulling up a city map on a secondary screen without being asked, the professional reflex of someone who processes information and converts it to useful form before the request is formally made. Stay there, Evelyn said. Don't move. I'm sending someone. You can't. Stay there, Dad. She hung up and looked at Yara. Yara was already texting. Then Rowan came through the door. He was breathing harder than when he'd left. His jacket was gone. The cloth she'd pressed against his arm was gone too, and the cut had reopened or been added to. She couldn't tell in the light. And there was a darkening along his left temple that was going to be substantial by morning. He looked at her, then at Yara, then at the screen, in a sequence that took about 2 seconds, and extracted whatever information was available from each. 67%, he said. Not a question. To journalists and international regulators, Evelyn said. Rourke is suspended. He went still. Why? My father has a 4th recording. She held his gaze. Rourke is on it, taking money, managing a specific case in his own district. The stillness in him was absolute. She watched him absorb it, not with shock, because he didn't have the kind of face that did shock cleanly, but with something worse than shock. The specific gravity of a man who has invested 4 years in a direction and is now standing in front of the wall it ran into. How certain, he said. My father is certain. She watched his jaw. How certain is he in your experience? A pause. Very, he said. Then we have a problem. We have several. He moved to the screen, looked at the counter. 14 minutes to journalist completion? 12 now, Yara said. And Rourke's people know the transmission was interrupted? They will within minutes if they don't already. He turned from the screen. He was thinking. She could see it, the quality of a mind moving fast through a structure and looking for the load-bearing points. Kay, he said. Outside, Yara said. I need him on the south entrance again. They're going to push when they realize the Rourke channel went dark. He looked at Evelyn. Your father? Where? Marsh and 11th. He has the physical drive. He's heading to a journalist he identified independently. Name, she told him. Something crossed his face. I know who she is, he said. She's legitimate. He pulled out his phone, typed something, sent it. I have someone 2 blocks from Marsh and 11th. They'll find him. He needs to keep moving. He can't sit on a corner. I told them to move him, not hold him. He pocketed the phone and looked at her directly. You did the right thing, stopping the Rourke transmission. I did what my father told me to do. That's what I said. She looked at him. There was something between them in the cold server room that hadn't been there in the kitchen that morning. Some quality of mutual weight. 2 people who have been through enough together in a short enough time that the professional distance has collapsed without either of them formally deciding to collapse it. 9 minutes, Yara said, and then the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a partial outage. Complete. Ceiling lights, monitor glow, the amber indicator lights on the server banks. All of it gone in a single instant that left the room absolutely black for the 2 seconds before the emergency backup stuttered on and filled the space with a dim, reddish half-light that turned everything the color of dried blood. Yara was at the workstation before Evelyn's eyes had fully adjusted. Connection is holding, she said. Backup power is sufficient for the transmission hardware, but the building's security systems are down. They cut the main, Rowan said. He was already at the door. They're coming in. How many entrances does this building have? Evelyn said. 7. Kay is covering one. I have one other person on the west side. He looked at her with the red emergency light making his face, something she'd have trouble describing to anyone later. Stay at the workstation. Whatever happens, stay at the workstation until Yara says the journalist transmission is complete. That's the only thing that matters now. Not me, not Kay, not anything else. Rowan, the only thing, he said, and went. She sat down at the workstation. 8 minutes. The building was not quiet anymore. There were sounds from multiple directions, movement, impact, things she couldn't interpret, and trained herself not to try to interpret because trying would take her attention somewhere it couldn't be. She watched the counter. Yara's hands on the keyboard were steady. She focused on the steadiness. 7 minutes. 74% to journalists. 5 minutes. 81%. At 4 minutes and approximately 40 seconds, 2 men came through the server room door. Not the way people come through a door normally. Fast. With intent. With the specific economy of movement that means someone has trained for exactly this type of entry into exactly this type of space. The first one looked at Evelyn and at the workstation and understood immediately what mattered. He came for the workstation. Yara moved in a way Evelyn had not anticipated and would think about later. Compact, precise, placing herself between the man and the equipment with a chair in her hands that connected with his sternum and bought approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds was not enough. Evelyn stood up from the chair. She was not trained for this. She was a woman with a finance background and a good memory and the specific kind of stubborn that runs in families, and that her father had in equal measure, and that had kept him alive for 3 years on his own in an unknown location carrying a physical drive and the weight of everything he knew. The second man came for her. She threw the chair. It was wrong, too wide, too slow, the kind of throw that comes from no training and a lot of adrenaline. But it was enough to make him adjust, to shift his weight to the left, and in the half second it bought her, she put both hands flat on the workstation desk and looked at the screen. 89%, 3 minutes. The man caught her arm and pulled her back from the desk, and she let him pull her because fighting it would have meant falling, and falling meant losing the seconds she needed to stay upright and present, and between this man and the ability to stop the transmission. She spun with the pull, not skill, just physics, and the momentum put her shoulder into his chest and both of them into the server bank on the right wall, and the impact knocked the breath out of her in a hard, involuntary gasp that she didn't have time to be embarrassed about. The server bank didn't give. Her shoulder did, in the bruising, non-structural way that means pain now and more pain tomorrow and nothing broken. She used the wall to push back off and the man caught her again, this time by the collar, and this time she couldn't spin out of it. "Stop the transmission," he said. His voice was professional. No heat in it, just instruction. She looked at the screen over his shoulder. 92%. "No," she said. He pulled her back from the desk again. She grabbed the edge of the desk with both hands and held it, and the desk was not bolted to the floor. She discovered this when her weight and his combined pulled it forward 6 inches, and the monitors shifted dangerously, and Yara, who had managed to keep herself between the first man and the equipment, said something sharp and profane and caught the nearest monitor with one hand. 94%. The door opened again and Rowan came through it, and the situation in the room changed, in the specific way that situations change when a particular kind of person enters them, not dramatically, not cinematically, but with the sudden reallocation of attention that happens when everyone in a space simultaneously recalculates who the most significant threat is. The man holding Evelyn's collar made a decision. He let go of her and turned to face Rowan. The first man, the one Yara had slowed with the chair, made the same decision half a second later. Evelyn turned to the screen. 96%. She put her hands on the keyboard, kept them there, watched the number. The sounds behind her were not sounds she was going to describe or think about in detail. She watched the screen. She breathed. Her shoulder was reporting pain at a volume that was going to become hard to ignore in the next 30 seconds, and she was ignoring it for now. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this and pressed them harder against the keyboard edge, and the shaking reduced to something manageable. 97. 98. She heard Rowan's voice behind her say something fast and low that she couldn't make out, and then she heard nothing for a moment that was too long, and she made the decision not to turn around because turning around would mean taking her eyes off the screen, and the screen was the only thing that mattered right now. That was what he had said. That was what she was doing. 99%. The room was very quiet. Then Yara said, "Journalists, complete." Evelyn let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for approximately 4 minutes. "International regulators," Yara said. 81%, 11 minutes to completion. Evelyn turned around. Rowan was standing. That was the first thing she confirmed. Upright, present, breathing, which was the information she needed before anything else. One of the two men was on the floor. The other was gone, which she registered as a problem to be addressed. Rowan had a new injury somewhere on his right side that he was managing by not moving that side more than necessary. His face in the red emergency light was the face of a man who has been running on something that isn't quite fuel anymore and knows it and is continuing anyway. "You held it," he said. 99%, she said. He looked at the screen, then at her hands, which were still shaking. He crossed the room and did something she didn't expect. He put one hand over both of hers, briefly, 3 seconds at most, the steady, certain weight of it before he let go and stepped back. "The second man got out," she said. "I know." "He'll report back." "Yes." 11 minutes for the regulators. "We need to hold the room for 11 minutes. She looked at his right side. "You're hurt." "I've been hurt before." "That's not a useful response." "It's the only one I have right now." He moved to the door and checked the corridor. Came back. "K is down. The west position is compromised. It's 2 of us and Yara for 11 minutes. She looked at the room. The server banks on 2 walls, 1 door. The workstation in the back corner where the transmission was running. The man on the floor who was beginning to move again. "Lock the door," she said. "There's no lock from the inside." "The desk," she said. "The one that isn't bolted." He looked at the desk. He looked at her. Something in his face did the thing she had named in the server room the first time, the recognition thing. Then he moved to the desk and she moved with him, and together they dragged it across the floor and wedged it under the door handle, which bought them something, though she couldn't say exactly how much. 9 minutes, Yara said from the workstation. She stood in the red light next to Rowan Mercer and breathed. Her shoulder hurt. Her hands had stopped shaking. Outside the building, the city continued its business in complete indifference, and somewhere in it, her father was moving east toward a journalist he had identified over 3 years of careful, terrified, methodical work, carrying the piece of the picture that made everything else make sense. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, a text from the unknown number, 2 words. She read them again. "What?" Rowan said. He was watching her face. She turned the screen toward him. The 2 words were, "He's here," which meant the journalist had her father, which meant the physical drive was out of the city's reach, which meant that regardless of what happened in this room in the next 9 minutes, part of the truth was already safe. She saw him understand it. She saw something in his face that was not quite relief. He was too controlled for clean relief, but its structural cousin, the loosening of a specific load. 7 minutes, Yara said. The desk against the door moved. Not much. 2 inches. Something on the other side testing the resistance. Rowan stepped in front of the door. He looked back at her once. She sat down at the workstation next to Yara, and she watched the counter and she did not look away from it again. The door moved again. 3 inches. The desk legs scraped against the floor. 88% to international regulators. 6 minutes. The desk moved 4 inches and held. 91%. 5 minutes. The desk gave another inch and Evelyn heard Rowan's voice, very low, saying something she couldn't make out, and then the impact against the door became more focused. Not testing anymore. Committed. And the desk legs were pulling thin lines across the floor tile, slow and grinding, and Yara's hands were completely steady on the keyboard, which Evelyn held on to as a fact, the way you hold a railing in the dark. 94%. 3 minutes, 96. 2 minutes. The desk came free of the door at the same moment that Evelyn heard, from somewhere outside the building, a sound that was not part of the city's ordinary inventory. She had no frame of reference for it, and then she did. The specific compressed sound of vehicles arriving fast and in number, multiple doors, organized movement. The door opened. 4 people came through it. Rowan stopped one in the doorway. The other 3 got past him. Yara stood up and moved left, and the first of the 3 went for the workstation, and Evelyn put herself between the man and the hardware, and felt the impact when he reached her, felt it in her whole left side, felt the floor against her knee when she went down, felt the specific quality of pain that is clean and structural, and means you are going to be on the floor for a moment, whether you choose to be or not. She was on the floor. The man was at the workstation. His hand was on the keyboard. She looked at the screen from the floor. The angle wrong. The text small. 98%. She heard the outside sound getting louder. Not further away, closer. Through the building now. The man at the keyboard was looking for the transmission controls. He didn't know the interface. He was working on instinct, looking for an interrupt, an abort, anything that would stop the flow before the counter hit 100. He was fast, but he was unfamiliar with the system, and Yara had designed the interface to be deliberately unintuitive to anyone who hadn't been trained on it specifically. 99. He found the abort control. She could see it from the floor, his hand moving to the right side of the screen, the cursor tracking toward the red button in the lower corner that Yara had built in as a mandatory safety feature. And that was now the most dangerous thing in the room. She was on the floor. She was 10 feet away. Her left side was reporting something serious, and she was overruling it. She got up. Not cleanly, not with any grace. She got up the way you get up when your body is telling you not to, and the thing you're getting up for overrides the body's preference entirely. She crossed the 10 feet. His hand hit the abort button at the same moment her shoulder hit him, which was not a plan. It was a collision, the specific physics of two moving objects arriving at the same point simultaneously, and the impact drove his hand off the keyboard and into the monitor, and the monitor went dark for a stuttering half-second before the transmission software resumed on backup display, and Yara's voice said, from somewhere to her left, "International regulators, complete." The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the noise level, which was still substantial. It went quiet in the specific interior way of a moment after which the thing that was being decided has been decided. Evelyn was on her feet. The man who had gone for the workstation was deciding whether to continue. She was looking at him with whatever was in her face right now. She didn't know what it was. She couldn't feel her face clearly. And whatever it was, he read it and made a choice and stepped back. The outside sounds had resolved themselves into something identifiable. Movement in the corridor, voices, organized, multiple, official in a way that had a specific acoustic texture she had never heard directed toward herself before. Rowan's voice from somewhere behind her. Evelyn. She turned. He was standing in the doorway. Behind him in the corridor, she could see people moving. Not Briggs's contractors, not private security in unmarked jackets. Different. Federal insignia. She didn't know which agency immediately, and it didn't fully matter yet. He looked at her. His right side was bad. He was working very hard not to show it and doing a passable job. "Are you all right?" he said. She thought about her shoulder and her knee and the left side of her rib cage and the specific quality of exhaustion that comes from 3 days of almost no sleep and 2 days of being inside a situation that required everything she had. "The transmission completed," she said. "I know. Both channels, without Rourke. I know. My father has the 4th recording. I know that too." He held her gaze. "Are you all right?" She breathed in, out. She thought about the question seriously, which she hadn't done in approximately 48 hours. "Ask me in an hour," she said. He almost smiled, the same shape she'd seen in the kitchen that morning. Not quite there, close enough to read. He was pale under the bruising, and his right hand was pressed against his side in a way that was no longer even pretending to be casual. And she thought, we are going to have a very difficult conversation about that in approximately 4 minutes. The corridor was filling with people. Someone was calling Rowan's name. Someone else was moving toward Yara with a professional urgency that meant questions requiring technical answers. And somewhere in the city, in a direction she didn't know, her father was sitting in a journalist's office or a car or a safe room with a physical drive on the table between them. And the 4th recording was being heard by ears that had the distance and the independence and the infrastructure to make it mean something. The thing they had built over 4 years. The thing that had cost 2 lives and 3 years of hiding and a wedding that was not a wedding and a locked door that was not a prison was no longer theoretical. It was in the world. It was moving through systems and networks and editorial chains and regulatory bodies. Unstoppable now. The way truth becomes unstoppable when it reaches the specific velocity at which enough people know it simultaneously. Evelyn stood in the red emergency light of the server room and felt the transmission's completion like a shift in atmospheric pressure, like the moment after a storm when the air changes character entirely. She looked at the screen one last time. The counter held at 100% on both channels. Still. Certain. Done. Then she looked at Rowan, who was looking back at her with the expression she had finally named, and she said, "You need to let someone look at that side." "In a minute." "Now, Rowan." "In a minute," he said, and the shape of the almost smile was back. And this time it was close enough to the real thing that the distinction finally stopped feeling academic. Outside, the city was still going, ordinary, unaware, but inside its ordinary machinery, in the channels and inboxes and secure servers of 3 journalists and 2 international regulatory bodies, 19 years of buried truth was arriving, document by document, audio file by audio file, the careful, patient architecture of a dead man's plan that had turned out not to be dead at all. The empire built on money instead of bullets was about to find out what happens when the money, it stops the way all empires stop. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a cascade. One thread pulled, then another. Then the whole structure discovering that what held it together was not strength, but the collective agreement of everyone involved to pretend the weakness wasn't there. The first story published at 4:47 in the morning. Not the journalist her father had reached. She was still verifying, still building the piece that would run 2 days later with the full weight of the 4th recording behind it. The first story came from one of the 3 original transmission targets, a financial investigative outlet whose editor had been sitting on peripheral evidence about Briggs's fund for 14 months and recognized within 20 minutes of the archive arriving what he was holding. He ran what he could verify in 6 hours. It was enough. By 6 a.m., 2 of the remaining investors in Briggs's fund had contacted separate legal counsel. By 8, the fund's primary brokerage accounts were frozen by international regulatory order, the Netherlands authority moving first on the basis of the offshore transfer documentation that had arrived in their secure inbox at 9:17 the previous evening. Sandra Voss was on a flight that was diverted before it landed. Caldwell Briggs was at home, which was both where they expected him to be and where they found him. Arthur Pell, the senior director inside Federal Financial Crimes, resigned his position at 6:43 a.m., the resignation letter consisting of 2 sentences that said nothing about anything and that everyone understood completely. Daniel Rourke's situation was more complicated because Rourke's situation always had been. Evelyn read about all of this in a hospital room on the 3rd floor of a facility 12 blocks from the server building, where she had spent the previous 4 hours being treated for 2 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder that had been relocated by a paramedic in the corridor of the server building in a procedure she would not be describing to anyone in detail, and a knee that was bruised to the bone but structurally intact. The hospital room had a window. The morning came through it in the same gray, flat light that had come through the kitchen window in the estate the previous morning, and she sat in the adjustable bed with her arm in a sling and her phone in her good hand and read the news the way you read about something you were inside 12 hours ago, with the particular dissociative quality of recognizing events you lived through, rendered in language that makes them seem both accurate and fundamentally foreign. Rowan was in surgery for 3 hours. She knew this because Marcus, who had arrived at the hospital around 2 a.m. with a cut above his eye and an expression of controlled concern that was the most emotion she'd seen from him, told her when she asked, and then sat in the chair outside her room for the remainder of the night, in the way of a man who has decided that this is where he should be and needs no further justification for it. She asked about Kay. Marcus looked at the floor and said Kay was going to be all right, which was a specific formulation that meant Kay was not all right yet. She didn't ask more about that. She sat with it instead. She asked about Lena. Marcus was quiet for a longer moment. Then he said they'd found her, which was not the same as saying they'd found her well, and the way he said it told her not to push further on that subject either. She asked about her father. "He's here," Marcus said, "in the building. They're checking him over. He's okay. He wants to see you. Tell him to sleep first." "He won't." "I know," she said. "Tell him anyway." Gerald Ashcroft came through her door at 7:15. He was thinner than the last time she'd seen him, which had been 11 months before he went into hiding, which meant she was now looking at a version of her father that had been through 3 years and several hundred miles in more fear than she could fully calculate. He was wearing clothes that fit badly, and his hair was longer than he'd ever worn it. He moved carefully, which was the heart condition, or the 3 years, or both. He looked at her in the sling in the adjustable bed, and his face did something she hadn't seen it do since she was very young, since her mother's funeral, the specific collapse of a parent's control when what they are looking at is damage that happened while they were trying to prevent it. "Dad," she said, "I'm fine." "I can see what fine looks like." His voice was rough. He sat in the chair Marcus had vacated with the careful movement of a man who is doing a calculation about what his body can manage. "Evelyn." "I know. I should have found a different way." "You found every way you could think of, and then you found two more," she said. "The fourth recording, the journalist. You were running a parallel operation inside our parallel operation. You had a contingency for the contingency for the contingency. It wasn't enough. It was exactly enough." She looked at him. It was precisely enough. Not more than needed, not less. You calibrated it over 3 years while hiding from people who thought you were dead, with a heart condition alone. It was enough, Dad. He looked at his hands in his lap. They were the hands she had grown up watching work, flipping through papers, building models and spreadsheets, the careful, deliberate hands of a man whose instrument was attention to detail. They were thinner now, too. "The phrase," he said. "You remembered it." "I remembered it." "You were 7. You said it once. You said it like it mattered." She looked at him. "Things said like they matter tend to stay." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face settled. Not to peace exactly, but to a lower altitude of pain. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the call. For what I had to tell you. For not being able to explain." "I know why you couldn't explain." "That doesn't make it—" "No," she said. "It doesn't. But it makes it what it was, which is a choice made under impossible conditions by someone who was trying to protect me with the only tools available." She let the pause sit. "I've made a few of those myself this week." He looked at the sling, at her knee, visible above the blanket's edge, wrapped and swollen. "The man you married," he said carefully. She was quiet for a moment. "He's in surgery." Her father looked at her. She recognized the look. The careful information-gathering look of a man processing data before he commits to an assessment. "Is he going to be all right?" "I don't know yet." "Do you want him to be?" She looked at the window. The gray morning light was taking on the first suggestion of something warmer along its lower edge. "Yes," she said. "I want him to be." Her father nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man filing an answer and accepting it without editorial. They sat together for a while without speaking. The hospital sounds moved around them. The PA system, the particular rhythm of a floor doing its morning work. The distant sounds of a building that processes difficulty and injury and damage and sends people back out the other side, incrementally repaired. She thought about what it meant to sit in this room with her father after 3 years of not knowing with full certainty that he was alive, of knowing it intellectually because she'd been told and choosing to believe it, but not knowing it the way you know it, when the person is in a chair 4 feet away and their breathing is audible and the light is catching the lines in their face. "The firm," she said eventually, "your firm, is gone," he said. "Has been for a while." "The debt. I imagine that's going to be a matter for the courts at this point." Rowan said the debt was always fabricated, structurally. If Briggs's fund is dismantled and the legal architecture of it is exposed, the debt instrument itself was constructed by the same entities. Her father looked at her. "You understand this?" "I read the folder about 6 times. She adjusted her arm in the sling. "The debt was engineered to create psychological pressure. It doesn't have a legitimate creditor anymore. The creditor is now a defendant." He sat with this. She watched him sit with it. The specific quality of a man who has carried a weight for so long that the announcement of its removal doesn't produce immediate relief, but a kind of wary recalibration, like a body adjusting to the absence of something it had organized itself around. "I built something for 20 years, he said quietly. "I know. It wasn't much. It was mine. I know, Dad. I'm 63 years old, and I have the clothes I was wearing when I left a safe house at 5:30 this morning, and a physical drive that is now in a journalist's possession. He said it without self-pity, just as fact, the inventory of a man taking stock. You also have me, she said. That's what's in the room. He looked at her. His eyes were wet, which she had seen perhaps 4 times in her life and which meant something specific each time. Yes, he said. That's what's in the room. Rowan came out of surgery at 9:41. The damage to his right side had been a laceration significant enough to require attention and blood loss significant enough to require replacement, and the combination had pushed the procedure longer than initially projected. Marcus brought her this information personally, appearing in her doorway at 9:48 with the expression of a man delivering a report he is relieved to be able to deliver in the positive register. He's asking for you, Marcus said. He's awake? He was for about 4 minutes. He went back under. But the 4 minutes he was awake, he asked where you were. She looked at Marcus. What did you tell him? I told him you were in a room 3 floors up with 2 cracked ribs and a dislocated shoulder, and that you were reading the news. And he said, quote, that sounds right. Marcus's expression did something she hadn't seen it do before, shifted briefly into something warmer and more human than his professional default. He also said to tell you the coffee on the 2nd floor is better than whatever they serve in this place. She almost laughed. It came out as something smaller, an exhale with warmth in it, not quite laughter, but its structural cousin. Tell him I'll be the judge of that, she said. Marcus nodded. He started to leave. Marcus, she said. He stopped. Thank you. For last night. For everything before last night. She held his gaze. 4 years is a long time to work toward something. He looked at her for a moment with the steady, unsentimental quality that was his default register. It went where it needed to go, he said. Then he left. She saw Rowan that evening. He was more awake by then, which was not the same as comfortable. He was in the specific, irritable state of someone whose body has been through a significant event and is reporting this continuously, and who is responding to the reports by ignoring them with diminishing success. He was sitting up at a shallow incline, which was apparently the maximum his right side was going to permit, and when she came through the door, he looked at her with the assessment quality, taking in the sling, the slow movement, the carefully maintained posture of someone managing pain, and his jaw tightened in the specific way that meant he was deciding not to say something. I know, she said before he could. I didn't say anything. You were about to. He looked at the window. The shoulder. Relocated in the corridor. I'm told it was efficient. That's one word. She sat in the chair next to the bed, which required a specific sequence of movements she had developed over the previous several hours that minimized the engagement of her left side. The news, she said. I read it. Voss is in custody. Briggs is in custody. The fund's accounts are frozen in 3 jurisdictions. She looked at him. The International Regulatory Action cites the documents from the archives specifically. I saw. The journalists are citing the audio files. I saw that too. The 4th recording goes to a federal grand jury in a different district from Rourke's, he said. I spoke with someone this morning about the chain of custody. It'll take time, but it'll hold. And Rourke, he was quiet for a moment. Rourke is going to fight it. He has the resources to fight it for a while. He looked at his hands on the blanket. But the recording exists and the grand jury will hear it, and the specific nature of what's on it is not the kind of thing that sophisticated lawyering makes disappear. It makes it slower, not gone. She sat with this. 4 years, she said. Yes. And the part at the end where the thing you built for 4 years turned out to have a rotten channel at its center. He looked at her directly. There was something in his face that was different from the previous 2 days. Not less controlled, but controlled around something rawer than she'd seen him admit to before. I should have looked harder at Rourke, he said. I needed a clean channel, and I found one that seemed clean, and I built toward it because I needed to build towards something. A pause. That's on me. Your father's plan caught it, she said. Your father's plan caught it. He said it was something she recognized as genuine acknowledgement, the kind that cost something. A 63-year-old man with a bad heart running a parallel intelligence operation from a safe house on his own caught what I missed in 4 years of professional investigation. He had specific information you didn't have access to. He was in the room with Rourke at some point. When? I don't know the full story yet. He was going to explain it when he wasn't. She stopped. When we were both in better condition. Rowan looked at the window for a moment. The city was doing its evening thing outside, the light shifting, the particular quality of a city settling into its later hours. He protected you, Rowan said, from the beginning. Every decision he made was structured around keeping you out of it until the moment you needed to be in it. I know. The account in your name, the authentication keys, the phrase. He turned from the window. He gave you the ability to do what needed doing at the exact moment it needed doing, and he built you a way out of every version of this he could imagine. She thought about being 7 years old in a kitchen that smelled like something she couldn't remember anymore, and her father bending down to her level and saying 7 words in a quiet voice like they were a secret between them, which they were, which they had been for 31 years without her knowing it. He's a careful man, she said. He's an extraordinary man, Rowan said. I want to meet him properly, when we're both upright. She looked at him. He wants to meet you too. He was careful about how he asked, but he asked. Something in Rowan's face did the thing she had named and still couldn't fully describe. The recognition thing, the seeing clearly thing, directed at her now with a quality that was different from how it had been at the wedding or in the kitchen or in the server room. Different in the way that something is different when it has been through enough that the original version of it is no longer quite accurate. The wedding night, she said. He looked at her. You could have told me. Even a sentence. You could have said, there are people in this building who are watching you, so I'm going to be outside the door. Yes, he said. I could have. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to mean the answer was being considered rather than constructed. You'd been through the ceremony, he said. The whole day. Arriving at a stranger's house to sleep in a room in a marriage you hadn't chosen. I didn't want to add... He stopped. I didn't want to be one more thing requiring something from you that night. She looked at him. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the city lights were coming on in the early dark, the particular urban constellation of a place settling into its evening. You sat on the floor of a hallway all night, she said. The floor was adequate. Because you didn't want to require something from me. Among other reasons. She thought about the locked door and the silence and the way she'd pressed her ear against it and heard breathing, slow and even, from the other side. She thought about the morning, the key in his pocket, the coffee, the folder on the counter, the way he had given her information in a sequence designed to be manageable, and the way she had eventually pushed past the sequence and demanded the load-bearing walls, and the way he had given those too. You're going to have to stop deciding what I can manage, she said. I know. I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you. I know that too. The almost smile, closer than usual. You're fairly clear about what you're telling versus asking. That's not going to change. I'm not asking it to. She looked at him. This man who had organized a 4-year investigation around a rotten foundation and hadn't stopped working when he found out. Who had sat on a cold floor all night because he'd decided it was the best way to protect someone he'd known for 6 hours. Who had run his operation with the specific quality of a person who cares about something that isn't themselves more than they usually let on. She thought about the 2 people he had said he'd lost. She thought about Marcus in the chair outside her room all night. She thought about Kay, who was going to be all right in the specific formulation of that phrase, and Lena, who was a different story that she didn't have the full shape of yet. Tell me about your brother, she said. When you're ready. Not tonight. He looked at her. Something shifted. Not open exactly, but the door to open, the specific quality of a person registering that a question has been asked with genuine intent and setting it aside for a moment when it can be answered properly. When I'm ready, he said. And the organization, she said. What it actually is, what you actually do. Also when I'm ready. That's 2 things I'm waiting for. I'm aware of the count. She looked at him. He looked at her. The hospital room was what it was. functional, indifferent, smelling of antiseptic, and the particular institutional quality of a building that processes human damage at volume. Outside the window, the city had completed its transition into evening, the lights of it moving in their ordinary patterns, carrying the ordinary freight of a few million people conducting their lives without reference to what had happened in a server room the previous night, or what was currently making its way through editorial processes and grand jury procedures and international regulatory frameworks. "The estate," she said. "Your building. What about it?" "The room on the third floor." "What about it?" She looked at him carefully. "It doesn't feel like mine yet." "I know," he said. "I'm not sure it will." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "We can change the room." "Can we?" "We can change whatever needs changing." He said it plainly, no performance in it. "I've been living in that building for 6 years, and the only room that works correctly is the kitchen." She almost laughed again. This time it made it further. Not quite a laugh, but something that had the shape and weight of one. It pulled at her ribs. She didn't mind. The trials, when they came, were long. She had been warned they would be, and they were longer than the warnings had suggested, which was also something she had been warned about. Caldwell Briggs entered a plea on the 17th month that reduced his exposure in exchange for testimony against the remaining defendants. Sandra Voss did not enter a plea, and her trial lasted 11 weeks and produced a verdict that Evelyn read about on her phone at 7:30 in the morning while standing in the kitchen of the estate making coffee that was, she had to concede, better than what the hospital had served. Arthur Pell's case moved more slowly, complicated by the nature of his position and the institutional resistance that follows when a senior figure inside a regulatory body is found to have been operating on behalf of the entity he was supposed to regulate. It moved. It reached a conclusion. The conclusion was the correct one. Daniel Rourke fought. He had said he would, and he did. With the resources available to a man who had spent 6 years collecting the specific kind of obligations that people in his position collect from people who need things from someone in his position. It took 2 years. The fourth recording held up, as recordings that have been authenticated through proper chain of custody procedures and played to a grand jury tend to do when the content is as unambiguous as what Gerald Ashcroft had captured and carried and protected and ultimately delivered through a combination of methodical planning and the specific courage of someone who has decided that the alternative to action is worse than the cost of it. Rourke was convicted on 3 counts. The sentencing was 6 years. Evelyn read the sentencing report on a Tuesday morning and sat with it for a while before she said anything to anyone. The fabricated debt instrument was invalidated in its entirety in a ruling that took 11 pages to explain what was, in structural terms, a simple finding: that a debt instrument created by an entity subsequently found to be a criminal enterprise in a transaction subsequently found to be designed not for financial recovery but for psychological coercion had no legitimate standing. The Ashcroft debt ceased to exist in the legal sense, which was a different thing from its ceasing to have happened, which was a different thing again from its ceasing to have cost what it had cost. Gerald Ashcroft did not rebuild his firm. He was 63 years old, and then 64, and then 65, and his heart was what it was, and he had spent 3 years doing things that had cost him more than the physical toll was fully accounting for. He moved to a smaller city, 3 hours from the one he'd spent 30 years in. He consulted occasionally for firms that valued the specific quality of attention that a man who reads his own paperwork and follows threads has, and that is rarer than it sounds. He called Evelyn every Sunday at 6 p.m., which was when she expected the call and which was when it came, with the regularity of something that has been decided and requires no further renegotiation. On the first Sunday call after the Rourke sentencing, he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Truly, truly." She was in the kitchen, the second-floor kitchen, which was the one that worked correctly and which she had over the course of approximately 18 months developed genuine attachment to. "Are you—" "Getting there," he said, which was the most accurate answer and which she accepted. "Rowan says to tell you the standing invitation is still standing." A pause. "I know. Dad. I'll come when I'm ready." "He's not what you thought he was," she said. when you arranged it, whatever you thought you were handing me. I know that now. He sat on the floor of a hallway all night. You've mentioned that. Because it matters. Her father was quiet for a moment. A man who sits on a cold floor all night to keep his word without asking for acknowledgement, he said, is a man with a certain kind of character. Yes, I know. Another pause. I'll come in the spring. He came in the spring. They had dinner in the kitchen because the kitchen was the room that worked, and Rowan made coffee afterward that her father accepted without comment and drank all of, and then looked at the cup as if revising an opinion. The conversation was careful, and then less careful, and then, by the end of the evening, not careful at all. Just three people in a room that had once been a building full of enemies and surveillance, and a locked door with a man sitting on the other side of it, talking about the things people talk about when the emergency has passed, and what remains is the ordinary texture of being alive and in a place and responsible to each other. Her father left at 10. Rowan walked him to the car. She watched from the kitchen window. The two of them in the exterior light, her father's thinned frame and Rowan's larger one, the conversation brief and the handshake that ended it, held a moment longer than handshakes usually are when two people are deciding what they are to each other. Rowan came back inside. She had more coffee ready. He sat across from her at the kitchen island and wrapped both hands around the mug the way he always did, and she looked at him in the kitchen light. The silver coming further into his hair than it had been a year and a half ago. The line the scar had left along his forearm from the server building night now faded to something she had to look for. The particular quality of a face that has been through enough that its defaults have shifted into something more settled. And thought about the folder on this counter 18 months ago, and the key in his pocket, and the words he had said in a hospital room while his right side was held together with surgical thread. We can change whatever needs changing. He liked you, she said. He was careful about it. He's careful about everything. That's not the same as not feeling it. Rowan looked at his coffee. He asked me something, outside. What? Whether I understood what I had. He looked at her. I told him I was working on it. She held his gaze. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing what it did. Moving, lit, indifferent, full of its millions of ordinary urgencies that had nothing to do with them. The estate around them had the quality of a building that is learning, incrementally, what it is for. Not a fortress, not a facility, something that doesn't have a clean name yet, but that has a kitchen with good coffee and a room on the third floor that they'd repainted twice trying to get right, and a hallway on the second floor where she sometimes walked past the spot on the floor and thought about what it meant that a person had sat there all night and said nothing about it. Working on it, she said. Actively, he said. She looked at him. The almost smile was there. The shape she had been watching move over 18 months, incrementally closer to the real thing. Tonight, it crossed the line. She wasn't sure he knew it had. She thought about telling him and decided it could wait. There was time for that. There was time for the things that needed time. The emergency was over, and what remained was the ordinary, difficult, necessary work of being people in a place together, which was harder than any of the things they'd done in a server room on a cold night, and more important than most of them. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside, the city moved in its patterns. The lights held against the dark the way lights do. Not forever, but long enough, which is all anyone can ask of them. The door at the end of the hallway stayed unlocked. It had been unlocked for a while now. Neither of them had mentioned this. They didn't need to. Some things are said better by the fact of them than by any accounting of them in words. By the key placed on the kitchen counter one morning and not picked up again, by the coffee made in a particular way that accounts for how another person takes it, by a man learning, slowly and imperfectly, to stop deciding what someone else can manage, by two people sitting in a kitchen at 10 o'clock on a spring night with the city outside and no emergency inside, and the long, unscheduled work of trust laid out in front of them like a road they'd chosen to be on. The folder was gone from the counter. It had been entered into evidence 8 months ago, and she didn't need it anymore. She had read it often enough that the structure of it lived in her the way the 7 words lived in her, the way things live in you when they have been carried long enough that they stop being separate from you and become part of the shape of how you understand the world. Her father had built a contingency inside a contingency inside a contingency. And at the center of all of them, underneath the account numbers and the authentication keys and the recordings and the parallel operations and the safe houses and the careful, terrified love of a man protecting the only person he had left to protect, at the center of all of it had been a 7-word phrase said once to a 7-year-old who had kept it without knowing she was keeping it, who had carried it for 31 years in the place where things said like they matter, go to stay. She had set it into a scanner in a cold room and it had opened everything. That was still true. That would remain true. Some keys, once used, don't stop being keys. They just become part of the story of how the door was opened, and the door stays open, and what you do with the open door is the part that belongs to you. She looked at Rowan Mercer, her husband in the legal sense, her partner in the operational sense, and in some third sense that neither of them had named yet, and that was perhaps better unnamed for now, and thought, here is the open door. Here is what we do with it. More coffee, he said. Yes, she said. He got up to make it. She watched the city out the window. The lights held.